Hi everyone, thank you so much for stopping by my channel. Here, I love sharing stories, useful knowledge, and personal experiences that can hopefully bring value to your day. I truly appreciate your support, so if you enjoy the content, consider subscribing and being part of this growing community.
Did you know that the average American man has only one or two people in his life he would genuinely call a best friend? Not just a buddy, not just someone to watch football with, but a person who knows your passwords, has a key to your house, and would show up at 3 in the morning without asking why. I was lucky enough to have that. His name was Marcus Webb, and for 22 years, he was the brother I never had. My name is Daniel Harlow, and for the last 3 years, I have been watching everything I built with my own hands quietly disappear. I want to tell you what happened, and more importantly, I want to tell you what I did about it. My wife and I met the way most people of my generation met, in a parking lot, arguing over the same space outside a grocery store in Atlanta on a Tuesday afternoon. She was driving a beat-up Civic and I was in a company truck, and neither of us was going to back down. I ended up letting her have the spot, not because I was a gentleman, but because she had a smile that made me feel like an idiot for even showing up that day. Her name was Carol. She was 31, I was 33, and 6 months later we got married in her mother's backyard in Savannah. 20 years. One daughter named Leah, and a house I designed myself out in Brookhaven. That was my life, and I was grateful for it. Marcus came into the picture even before Carol did. We met in our mid-20s on a job site, both of us junior architects at the same firm, both of us broke and eating gas station sandwiches for lunch. We grew together professionally. When I started my own firm, he came with me as a partner. When his first marriage collapsed, I let him sleep on my couch for 4 months. When my father died, Marcus was the one who drove me to the funeral home because Carol was 7 months pregnant with Leah, and I didn't want her behind the wheel. That is the kind of friendship I am talking about. For most of our marriage, things were good. Not extraordinary, good. Carol worked in hospital administration, and she was sharp at it, well-respected, always being offered promotions. I ran my firm. We ate dinner together most nights, took vacations to the coast every August, argued about nothing important, made up without much drama. Leah grew up and married a man named Patrick, a civil engineer from Nashville who I liked immediately because he asked me questions about my work and actually listened to the answers. They had a baby on the way by the time any of this started. The first sign I noticed was a small one. Carol started going to the gym at times she had never gone before. Not early morning or after work, but midday on Saturdays when we used to have lunch together. I didn't think much of it. The second sign was her phone, which had always sat face up on the kitchen counter, suddenly spending most of its time face down. The third sign was Marcus canceling on our Wednesday dinners, which we had kept up for 15 years, first with excuses about work and then without excuses at all. I am not a man who jumps to conclusions. I have spent my entire career looking at blueprints and finding the mistake that everyone else missed, which means I know the difference between a coincidence and a structural problem. By October of that year, I had seen enough structural problems that I stopped pretending the building was fine. I did not confront anyone. I did what I would do on any job. I gathered information first. I hired a firm. It took them 9 days. The report they handed me on a Thursday morning in my office was 24 pages long, and the first photograph was enough to tell me everything I needed to know. My wife and my best friend had a restaurant in Buckhead I had never been to. Sitting across from each other the way people sit when they have done this many times before and stop being careful about who might see them. I read all 24 pages. When I finished, I sat in my office for a long time and did not move. Then I called my assistant and told her to cancel my afternoon. Then I drove to a park near our house and sat on a bench and watched dogs run around for about an hour. I want you to understand that I am not a man who cries easily, but I will tell you that bench was a private moment. I am glad no one witnessed. That evening, I came home and made dinner and ate with my wife and said nothing. She talked about her day. I listened. I smiled at the right moments. I thought about 20 years and I thought about the man who slept on my couch, and I made a decision. I was not going to react. I was going to respond. There is a significant difference. I want to be clear about something. The moment I read that report, the marriage was over. There was no scenario in which I was going to ask Carol to explain herself and then sit down and do couples counseling and pretend that the man I trusted more than almost anyone on earth had not been sleeping with my wife for the better part of a year. Some men might choose that path and I respect it. It was not my path. What I decided was that I was going to be strategic, patient, and thorough. I was going to make sure that when I walked out of this marriage, I walked out with everything that was rightfully mine, and I was going to make sure that both of them understood completely and permanently that I had known. The next morning, I called a divorce attorney named Sandra Pierce, who had been recommended to me twice over the years by colleagues who had been through their own versions of this situation. Sandra was not warm or soft-spoken. She was precise, experienced, and the kind of woman who immediately identified every asset and liability in our marriage with the efficiency of someone who has done it thousands of times. She told me clearly, do not move out, do not change behavior, do not tip your hand, document everything. Make no large financial moves yet, let me prepare. I followed her instructions exactly. For 6 weeks I lived in my own house as a man who did not know. I had dinner with my wife. I attended her hospital's annual charity gala with her and shook hands with her colleagues and made small talk. I went to Patrick and Leah's house for Sunday dinner twice and watched my daughter's belly grow and felt the specific grief of knowing that something enormous was about to change in her life too, because her parents were not going to be together for the birth of her child. That part was the hardest. Leah had no idea. She was glowing, excited, and completely unaware that her father was quietly dismantling 20 years of shared finances with the help of a very good attorney. Marcus called me in November asking if I wanted to catch a game that weekend. I told him I was swamped with a project and maybe next week. He said, sure. I wonder if he felt anything. I honestly don't know. There was one evening in November that came close to breaking me. I was working late at my desk and Carol came in and brought me coffee the way she always had, in the blue mug she bought me years ago from a craft fair in Asheville. And she sat on the edge of my desk and we talked for a while about Leah's upcoming due date and whether the guest room needed repainting before the baby arrived. She was warm and easy and familiar, and for a moment, I felt the full weight of 20 years sitting in the room with us, and I almost said something. Then I thought about the photographs, and I didn't. Sandra called me in early December. We were ready. Leah went into labor on the 14th. Patrick called me from the hospital, and I was there within 30 minutes. Carol was already there when I arrived. I found Leah's room and went straight to my daughter, who was doing fine and handling the whole thing better than I would have. Carol was sitting in the chair by the window and she smiled at me when I came in. I smiled back. We were both very good at pretending that night. Patrick pulled me into the hallway at one point while we were waiting and lowered his voice. He had a look on his face that I recognized. The kind of careful expression a man wears when he has decided to say something he's been holding for a while. He said, Daniel, I need to ask you something and I apologize in advance if I'm out of line. I told him to go ahead. He said, has something been going on with Carol? I don't want to worry Leah right now, obviously, but I've noticed some things, and Leah has mentioned that Carol seems distracted lately. And a couple months ago, I saw her car parked outside a restaurant downtown when she'd told Leah she was at a conference in Macon. I looked at my son-in-law for a moment. I thought about what to tell him. Then I told him the truth, quietly, standing in a hospital hallway while my daughter was about to give birth on the other side of the door. I told him what I knew when I had found out and what I had been doing since. I told him we would discuss the details later, but that things were going to change in the new year, and I needed him to say nothing to Leah until after the baby came. Patrick is not a dramatic person. He absorbed what I said and nodded slowly and said, all right, what do you need from me? That right there is why I liked him from the day I met him. My grandson was born at 11:47 that evening. 7 pounds, 4 ounces. They named him James. I held him in the hallway while a nurse fussed over something nearby, and I looked at his face, which was red and scrunched and entirely unimpressed with the world it had just arrived in. And I felt something shift. Not sadness. Clarity. Whatever happened next, this child existed. That was a fact that nothing could change. Carol cried when she held him. Happy tears. Genuine ones. I watched her and I felt something complicated that I am not going to try to explain. I drove home alone that night and sat in the kitchen for a long time. Then I went to bed and slept better than I had in 2 months. December moved quickly. Sandra finalized everything. On her recommendation, I had already quietly transferred the ownership of a rental property I held individually into a trust for Leah, which was a transaction we had discussed doing for estate planning purposes years before and which was now legally complete. The house, since we owned it jointly, would need to be handled in the proceedings, but Sandra had done her preparation and the balance of assets tilted significantly in my favor, given what we could document. I organized Christmas. I had been thinking about it since October, actually, since the week after I read the report. I am an architect. I plan things. I think about how spaces are going to be experienced before anyone walks into them. I decided that the last thing I was going to do before I stepped out of this marriage was make sure that both Carol and Marcus understood the full picture of what they had done, not with rage, not with cruelty, but with complete and permanent clarity. I wanted them to know that I had not been fooled. I wanted them to know who they were dealing with. I invited Marcus to Christmas dinner. Carol thought I was being generous and mature. She thanked me, actually, which required a significant amount of composure on my part to receive gracefully. She told me it was good of me to make sure Marcus wasn't alone for the holidays since he had no family in Atlanta. I told her it was the least I could do. She had no idea that Marcus had already been served his paperwork via certified mail delivered to our office, which he opened in front of his assistant the previous Wednesday, and that Sandra had already filed everything we needed. Carol herself would receive her copy of the filing the day after Christmas. But that evening, they did not know any of that. Leah and Patrick came with the baby. Carol's sister drove up from Savannah. My neighbor Bill stopped by for an hour. It was, from the outside, a normal Christmas gathering in a well-designed house in Brookhaven, Georgia, with good food and a baby being passed around and football on in the background. After dinner, while everyone was settled and the baby was asleep in the portable crib in the living room, I stood up and said I had something for everyone. I handed Leah and Patrick an envelope first. Leah opened it and looked at what was inside and looked up at me and said, "Dad, what is this?" I told her it was the deed to the Decatur rental property transferred into her name 2 weeks prior. No mortgage. Fully hers. Her eyes went wide and she reached for Patrick's hand and looked at me with an expression I am going to keep for the rest of my life. Carol sat up straighter and looked at me with a question on her face. I met her eyes and smiled pleasantly. Then I reached into the bag beside my chair and took out a flat box wrapped in silver paper and handed it to Carol. She unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a watch, a beautiful one, silver with a pale face, the kind she had pointed out to me at a store 3 years ago and said she loved. She lifted it out of the box and turned it over and read the engraving on the back. It said, "For 20 years of a life well built. Daniel." She looked up at me with something soft in her expression and said quietly, "Daniel, this is beautiful." I told her to look at it carefully, because it was the last gift I would ever give her. The softness left her face. I said, "I also have something for Marcus." I reached into the bag and pulled out a manila envelope and set it on the coffee table and slid it across to him. Marcus looked at the envelope and then looked at me. He had good instincts, always did. He knew, before he opened it, what was inside, but he opened it anyway, the way people feel compelled to do. Inside was a single printed page, a summary, prepared by Sandra's office, of every document in the investigator's file. Names, dates, locations, a clear and organized account of a year of what I had paid to have documented. Attached behind it was a copy of the divorce filing already submitted. Marcus set the page down on his knee. Carol made a sound that I will not try to transcribe. Leah looked between her mother and me with an expression that reminded me of the face she used to make as a child when she understood something was very wrong but hadn't yet processed what. I said, "Carol, you're going to receive your official copy the day after tomorrow. Marcus, yours was delivered to the office on the 20th, so you've had a few days with it." I paused. I wanted to wait until now to have this particular conversation because I wanted to look at both of you at the same time. Carol said my name once quietly. I said, "You are welcome to stay for dessert. I baked a pie this morning which I think turned out well. What I am not going to do is pretend that I don't know what I know, or act as though the last year did not happen, or apologize for anything that I am about to do." I turned to Marcus. "You were my closest friend for 22 years. You slept on my couch. You were in my wedding. My daughter called you Uncle Marcus from the time she could talk." I let that sit in a room for a moment. "I don't have anything dramatic to say to you. I think you already understand." Marcus was quiet. Whatever I had expected from him, an explanation, an outburst, some version of himself I hadn't seen before, none of it came. He sat very still and he looked at the floor. In a way, that was its own kind of answer. Carol was not still. Carol was trying to say several things at once, and none of them were forming into complete sentences. I heard the words explain and not what and please in various combinations, and I understood what she was trying to say. She wanted the chance to reframe it, to give me a version of events that would make the photographs and the documents and the year of documented meetings mean something other than what they meant. I had heard that speech in my head many times over the past 6 weeks. I already knew every version of it. I said, "Carol, I don't need an explanation. I have the facts. I said it gently. I want to be clear about that. I was not cruel. I was not loud. I had made a deliberate choice not to perform my anger, because my anger was not the point. The point was the truth, sitting on that coffee table in a manila envelope, and the fact that they both now knew I had been holding it for 6 weeks while they assumed I was ignorant. Carol's sister excused herself quietly from the room. Patrick took the baby and followed her. Leah sat where she was and looked at her mother, and I watched something shift in my daughter's face, the thing that shifts when a child looks at a parent and sees them, for the first time, simply as a person who made a mistake. Marcus stood up and picked up his jacket from the arm of the chair and said to no one in particular that he was going to go. He paused at the door for a moment and I thought he was going to say something. He didn't. The door closed behind him and that was the end of 22 years. Carol sat across from me in her own living room in our house that I had designed for us, and she said, "How long have you known?" I told her. She pressed her fingers to her lips and looked at the watch in her lap. She said, "You've been here this whole time. Every dinner. Thanksgiving. The hospital." I nodded. She said, "And you never said anything." I told her that was correct. She was quiet for a long time after that. Then she said very softly, "I'm so sorry, Daniel." I believe she meant it. I think she understood in that moment what she had lost. Not just the marriage, but the specific texture of 20 years, with someone who knew how to be patient and precise, and who had just demonstrated both of those qualities in a way she would remember. I told her she could stay in the house through the filing period, and we would work with Sandra to handle the rest. I told her I was not interested in making the process bitter or dramatic, and that I hoped she wasn't either. I told her that Leah was the most important thing, and that I intended to be a present grandfather regardless of what the proceedings looked like, and I hoped she intended the same. Then I went to the kitchen and sliced the pie. Leah found me there a few minutes later. She stood in the doorway with her arms crossed and a look on her face that mixed grief and something close to admiration. She said, "Dad, when did you become this person?" I handed her a slice and said I had always been this person. She just hadn't needed to see this side of him before. She laughed even though she was crying a little. "That is my daughter." Patrick appeared behind her and gave me a look that communicated without any words exactly what he wanted to say. I gave him a slice of pie too. The proceedings took 4 months. Carol was cooperative, which I had hoped for and not entirely counted on. Sandra handled everything efficiently. The house was sold. The assets were divided in accordance with what we had prepared. Marcus and I had no further contact. Not a call, not a message, not a mutual friend's attempt to broker a conversation. Some doors closed permanently, and that one did. I moved into a furnished apartment in Midtown in February, which I am not going to pretend was not a difficult adjustment for a man who designs houses for a living and had not rented since his 20s. I bought a good coffee maker and I ran along the belt line in the mornings, and I called Leah every Sunday, and eventually I stopped waking up in the night reaching for a space in the bed that had always been occupied and now wasn't. In May, I accepted an invitation from a colleague to attend a presentation at Georgia Tech about sustainable architecture and urban housing. The woman who gave the presentation was named Helen, and she was 49, and she had been running her own firm in Decatur for 12 years, and she was the most straightforwardly interesting person I had sat next to in several years. We had coffee afterward. We had dinner 2 weeks after that. I am not going to tell you that she fixed anything because she didn't need to. I had fixed what needed fixing before she arrived. I will tell you that she is patient, confident, and does not own a phone that sits face down on a counter. On a Saturday morning in June, I was at Leah and Patrick's house in the backyard sitting in a lawn chair with my grandson James asleep against my chest, which is a specific weight that I recommend to anyone who has ever felt like their life was becoming unrecognizable. He was 7 months old, and he smelled like baby shampoo and absolute innocence, and he had his mother's ears and his grandfather's stubborn way of clenching his jaw in his sleep. Leah brought me a cup of coffee and sat in the chair beside me, and we didn't talk for a while, which is one of the things I have always loved about her. Then she said, "Are you okay, Dad?" "Really?" I thought about it honestly, and I told her I was. She said, actually okay, not just handling it." I said both, actually. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "For what it's worth, I think you were remarkable through all of it." I told her the bar for remarkable in that situation was not especially high. She laughed and said, "No, I mean it. You were never mean. You never made me feel like I had to choose. You just handled it." I told her that was the only way I knew how. James stirred against my chest and made the small sound he makes before deciding to wake up properly, and I shifted him slightly and he settled again. I have thought about Marcus. I will not pretend otherwise. 22 years is not something you release cleanly. I think about specific afternoons and specific conversations. The way he used to argue about every project decision, until the exact moment he suddenly agreed with you and then acted as though he had thought of it himself. The way he took his coffee, the sound of his laugh. I think about what he was thinking during those months. Whether there was a version of him that understood what he was doing and chose it anyway, or whether he found a way to believe it was something other than what it was. I don't have the answer to that. I have stopped requiring one. Carol I see occasionally, at things related to Leah and James. She is polite and so am I. She looks, I think, somewhat diminished by what happened. Not in a way I take satisfaction in, just in the honest sense that the aftermath of that kind of decision tends to settle into a person's face. She and Marcus did not stay together, which I learned secondhand and which surprised no one who had read that investigator's report carefully. What I know now, that I did not know 2 years ago, is that the version of yourself that exists in the middle of something terrible, the one sitting on that bench in the park watching dogs run, trying to understand how both things can be true at the same time. That version of you is not the permanent version. It is a moment in a longer story. What you do with the moment is the part that counts. I designed a house last spring that I am genuinely proud of. A net zero home for a young family in Grant Park, solar passive design. The kind of project that makes the work feel worthwhile again. I put more of myself into it than I had into a project in years. Helen came to the site walkthrough. She stood in the main living space looking at the way the afternoon light came in through the clerestory windows I had specified. And she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You're very good at this." I told her I'd had some recent practice at building things that last. James said his first word in July. It was not mama or dada. It was something that sounded to everyone present like more, which Patrick said was a completely accurate summary of James's general outlook on life. I was there for it, sitting at Leah's kitchen table, when he looked at the spoonful of sweet potato being offered to him and said it with complete clarity and conviction. I wrote it down. Some things you keep,